The man who tore apart French society with nothing but a pen died choking on the fumes from a blocked chimney. Was it an accident? Murder? No one could prove anything, but Emile Zola's death in 1902 was as controversial as the life he'd lived, a life spent exposing the rot beneath the surface of respectable society. Tonight we're following his journey from a desperate poverty to becoming the most dangerous writer in France. Picture Paris in 1840. Not the romantic city of postcards, but a seething metropolis of cholera outbreaks, open sewers, and brutal class divisions. Into this world, on April 2nd, Émile-Édouard Charles-Antoine Zola was born. His father, Francesco Zola, was an Italian engineer with grand ambitions. His mother, Émilie Aubert, was French, 20 years younger than her husband, and quietly terrified of the precarious life they were building. Francesco had vision. He'd designed a canal system for the city of Aix-en-Provence in southern France, a project that would bring clean water to thousands and make the family's fortune. When Émile was 3, they moved south to oversee construction. The boy grew up watching his father sketch plans, argue with contractors, and dream of the prosperity just around the corner. Then Francesco died. Émile was 7 years old. The canal project collapsed into legal disputes. The investors vanished. Overnight, the Zola family went from comfortable middle class to crushing poverty. Emily found herself alone in a city where her husband's creditors circled like vultures, with a young son to feed, and no money, no connections, no prospects. They moved into progressively smaller apartments. Emily took in sewing work, her fingers bleeding over embroidery that paid almost nothing. Young Emile watched his mother's face grow thin and hard. He learned what it meant to be hungry. Not the romantic hunger of skipped meals, but the grinding, constant hunger that makes your stomach hurt and your head feel light. He learned what it felt like when the landlord came demanding rent they didn't have. School became his escape. The Collège Bourbon in Aix accepted him on scholarship, recognizing the bright, intense boy who devoured books with frightening speed. Here he met Paul Cézanne, the son of a wealthy banker, who would become his closest friend. The two were inseparable, spending hours wandering the countryside around Aix, talking about art and literature and their dreams of conquering Paris. Cézanne wanted to paint. Zola wanted to write. Both understood they were trapped in this provincial city, suffocating under small-town expectations. Cézanne had his father's money as a safety net. Zola had nothing but ambition and the memory of his mother's tired eyes. At school, Zola excelled at literature and failed spectacularly at mathematics. Numbers made no sense to him, but words were power. He wrote poetry, terrible adolescent poetry, full of romantic clichés, but beneath the clumsy verses was a voice struggling to be heard. His teachers noticed. They encouraged him. They also warned him that literature was not a career for a boy with no inheritance. The teenage Zola was moody, intense, prone to black depressions that would plague him his entire life. He had inherited his father's dreams, but none of his father's practical skills. He couldn't build canals or design aqueducts. All he could do was observe, absorb, and remember everything he saw. In 1858, when Émile was 18, Emily made a desperate decision. They would move to Paris. The city terrified her, but Aix offered nothing. At least in Paris there might be opportunities, connections, some way to claw back what they'd lost. They sold what little they had and boarded the train north. Paris destroyed them. The city they arrived in was in the middle of Baron Haussmann's massive reconstruction. Medieval neighbourhoods were being demolished to make way for broad boulevards. Thousands of working-class families were being displaced, pushed to the outskirts, crammed into tenements where disease spread like wildfire. The Zolas arrived with just enough money to rent a tiny room in the Latin Quarter, the bohemian district where students and artists lived in picturesque squalor. Picturesque from a distance, up close it was hell. Their room was on the 6th floor of a building with no heat. In winter, Ice formed on the inside of the windows. Emile tried to continue his studies, enrolling at the Lycée Saint-Louis, but he was behind, distracted. Increasingly aware that his mother was starving herself to keep him fed, he failed his baccalaureate exam, twice. The shame was crushing. Without that diploma, he couldn't attend university, couldn't become a teacher, couldn't access any respectable profession. He was 19 years old and already a failure. For 2 years, Zola drifted. He took odd jobs that lasted days or weeks before he was fired or quit in frustration. He worked as a clerk, copying documents until his hand cramped. He unloaded freight at the docks. He tried tutoring but had no patience for wealthy children who took their education for granted. The whole time he was writing, filling notebooks with observations, character sketches, fragments of stories that went nowhere. The poverty was grinding him down. His clothes became threadbare. He sold his books one by one to pay for food. He developed a chronic cough from the damp rooms they could barely afford. Some nights, he went to bed so hungry he couldn't sleep. Other nights, he lay awake consumed by a rage so intense it frightened him. Paris in the early 1860s was a city of extremes. Emperor Napoleon III's Second Empire was in full swing, a period of rapid industrialization and staggering inequality. The newly constructed boulevards were lined with elegant shops displaying luxuries that most Parisians could never afford. Department stores were opening, temples of consumption where the wealthy could browse for hours. Meanwhile, in the working-class districts, people lived 10 to a room and worked 16-hour days in factories for wages that barely covered bread. Zola saw all of it. He walked everywhere because he couldn't afford the omnibus. He observed the prostitutes in the Bois de Boulogne, the homeless sleeping under bridges, the workers spilling out of factories at dawn. He watched the bourgeoisie promenade in their fine clothes, pretending the suffering around them didn't exist. He absorbed the contrast, the hypocrisy, the casual cruelty of a society that ground up the poor to fuel the comfort of the rich. His friend Cézanne had followed him to Paris, chasing his dream of becoming a painter. Cézanne's father sent him an allowance enough to survive. The two friends would meet at cheap cafes, splitting a single glass of wine between them, arguing about art and philosophy, and what they would do when their genius was finally recognized. Cézanne was painting in a style no one understood yet. Zola was writing novels no one wanted to publish. In 1862, everything changed. Zola landed a job at Hachette, one of Paris's major publishing houses. He started in the shipping department, packing books into crates. It was manual labor, but it was steady work with a regular salary. More importantly, it put him inside the machinery of the publishing world. He worked like a man possessed. He arrived early, stayed late, volunteered for every task. Within months, he'd been promoted to the publicity department. Now he was reading books, writing catalogue copy, learning how the business actually worked. He was meeting authors, editors, critics. He was building connections, and he was watching how books were marketed, what sold and what didn't, which authors were taken seriously and which were dismissed. He noticed that the respectable literature of the day, the novels that won prizes and critical acclaim, were romantic fantasies that had nothing to do with the reality he saw around him. They were full of noble heroes and pure heroines, of virtue rewarded and vice punished, of a moral universe that bore no resemblance to actual life. He decided he would write differently. At night, after work in the cramped apartment he now shared with his mother in a slightly better neighbourhood, Zola wrote his first serious novel. La Confession de Claude was autobiographical, drawing on his experiences with a prostitute named Berthe, who he'd briefly lived with during his darkest period of poverty. The novel was raw, honest, and shocking. It portrayed a young man trying to save a woman from prostitution and failing, dragged down by his own poverty and her desperation. Hachette published it in 1865. Zola was 25 years old. The novel sold poorly but attracted attention. Critics were scandalized by its frank depiction of sexuality and poverty. Some called it immoral. Others recognized a new voice, unpolished but powerful, willing to write about things respectable authors ignored. Zola had found his subject, the truth. Not the pretty version, not the sanitized version, but the ugly, complicated, human truth of how people actually lived. He would spend the rest of his life pursuing that truth, no matter who it offended or what it cost him. The success, modest as it was, gave him confidence. He quit his job at Hachette to write full-time, a decision that terrified his mother but felt inevitable to him. He started reviewing art exhibitions, writing fierce defences of the new painters like Manet and Cézanne who were being rejected by the official salon. He was making enemies among the establishment, but also making a name for himself as a fearless critic. His journalism paid barely enough to survive, but it kept him connected to the artistic ferment of Paris in the 1860s. He was meeting the writers and artists who would define the era: Flaubert, the Goncourt brothers, Manet, Monet. They gathered at cafes in Montmartre, arguing until dawn about realism, naturalism, and the role of art in society. Zola was developing a theory. Literature, he believed, should operate like science. A novelist should observe society with the detached eye of a scientist, documenting the forces, heredity, environment, social pressure that shaped human behaviour. The romantic notion of free will was an illusion. People were products of their circumstances, driven by forces they barely understood. He called it naturalism, and it would revolutionise literature. But first he needed a vehicle for his ideas. He needed a project vast enough to contain everything he wanted to say about French society, about power and poverty, about ambition and corruption, about the machinery that ground people into dust. In 1868, Zola conceived of a plan that would consume the next 25 years of his life. He would write a series of novels, 20 books following multiple generations of a single family through every level of French society. He would show how heredity and environment shaped lives, how the flaws of one generation poisoned the next, how individuals were caught in forces beyond their control. He called it Les Rougon-Macquart, the natural and social history of a family under the Second Empire. It was an audacious project, unprecedented in its scope. No French writer had attempted anything like it. Balzac had written multiple novels set in the same fictional world, but Zola's plan was different. He would follow the biological inheritance of a single family, tracking how alcoholism, mental illness, and moral weakness passed from parent to child, from generation to generation. He would use fiction to prove scientific theories about heredity and environment. The publishers thought he was insane. 20 novels about the same family? Who would read them all? But Zola was convinced. He drew up elaborate genealogical charts, mapping out 5 generations of the Rougon and Macquart families. He planned which characters would appear in which novels, how their fates would intersect. Some would be wealthy, others poor. Some would rise, others would fall. The only constant would be the tainted blood they shared, the hereditary curse that doomed them all. The first novel appeared in 1871. The Fortune of the Rougon introduced the family's origins during the coup d'etat that brought Napoleon III to power. It sold modestly. The second novel did better, but it was the 7th novel in the series that would change everything. L'Assommoir was published in 1877. It told the story of Gervaise Macquart, a laundress in Paris who dreams of a better life but is destroyed by poverty, her husband's alcoholism, and her own weakness. Zola had spent months researching the working-class neighbourhoods of Paris, visiting laundries, talking to workers, observing how they lived. He wrote in their language, using their slang, their rough grammar. He showed them drinking, fighting, making love, dying. He showed them as they actually were, not as bourgeois readers wanted to imagine them. The novel was a scandal. Conservative critics called it pornographic, disgusting, an insult to the working class. They said Zola was dragging literature through the gutter. Some bookstores refused to stock it. The Catholic Church condemned it, but readers couldn't get enough. The novel became a bestseller, selling over 100,000 copies in its first year. Suddenly, everyone in Paris was talking about Emile Zola. He was 37 years old, and for the first time in his life, he had money. Real money. He bought a house in Meudon, a village along the Seine northwest of Paris. He could finally support his mother properly. He could write without worrying about rent. Success had come late, but it had come completely. Yet success brought new problems. Now the critics watched his every move. Every novel was dissected, attacked, defended. The literary establishment, which had ignored him when he was poor, now treated him as a threat. Academic critics dismissed naturalism as crude, as beneath true art. Religious leaders condemned his materialism, his reduction of human beings to animals driven by base instincts. Zola didn't care. He kept writing, one novel per year, like clockwork. Nana, in 1880, told the story of a courtesan who destroys every man she touches. It was even more scandalous than L'Assommoir. People lined up outside bookstores on publication day. Germinal, in 1885, depicted a coal miners' strike with such brutal honesty that it became a rallying cry for the labour movement. La Terre, in 1887, showed peasant life in all its violence and greed. Each novel pushed further, showed more, refused to look away from the ugliness of modern life. The method was always the same. Zola would choose his subject, then spend months researching. For Germinal, he went down into the coal mines, talked to miners, attended union meetings. For La Bête Humaine, about railway workers, he rode in locomotive cabs, interviewed engineers, learned the technical details of how trains operated. For L'Argent, about financial speculation, he studied the stock exchange, read banking journals, observed traders. Nothing was invented. Everything was documented, verified, built from observed reality. His enemies multiplied. In 1887, a group of young writers published a manifesto attacking Zola and naturalism. They called it the Manifesto of the Five, and it accused him of obscenity, of wallowing in filth, of degrading French literature. The signatories were mostly forgotten within a decade, but the attack stung. Even some of his former allies, like Guy de Maupassant, began to distance themselves from naturalism's extreme claims. Zola pressed on. By 1893, he had completed all 20 novels of the Rougon-Macquart series. It had taken 25 years, exactly as he'd planned. The final volume, Dr. Pascal, was a kind of summation, a novel about a doctor studying his own family's hereditary traits. It was Zola's most personal book and the least read. The public had grown tired of naturalism. A new generation of writers was emerging, symbolists and decadents, who rejected Zola's scientific approach in favour of dreams, mysticism, and pure aesthetics. He was 53 years old. He'd achieved everything he'd set out to do. The boy from Aix, who'd nearly starved in Paris, was now one of the most famous writers in the world. His books sold in every country. His face appeared in newspapers. His opinions on social issues carried weight. He'd married Alexandrine Mailly in 1870, a woman who'd been his companion through the poorest years. They had no children, which caused him private grief, but their marriage was stable, comfortable. And then everything exploded. December 1894, a French army captain named Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason for allegedly selling military secrets to Germany. He was Jewish. The evidence against him was thin, manufactured, but the military court convicted him anyway and sentenced him to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. Anti-Semitism was fashionable in France in the 1890s. Nationalist newspapers fanned the flames. Most of the public supported the conviction. Zola paid little attention at first. He was planning a new trilogy of novels, moving away from naturalism towards something more optimistic, more hopeful. But his friends began investigating the Dreyfus case, and what they uncovered was damning. The evidence was forged. The real traitor was another officer, Ferdinand Wolfson Esterhazy, who was being protected by the military establishment. Dreyfus was innocent. The French army had knowingly convicted an innocent man to hide their own incompetence and to satisfy anti-Semitic prejudice. For 2 years, Zola watched as evidence of the injustice accumulated. The army refused to reopen the case. The government supported the military. Most newspapers continued to attack Dreyfus. When Esterhazy was finally tried in 1898, a military court acquitted him in a sham proceeding that lasted 3 minutes. That night, Zola made a decision that would cost him everything. He would write the truth. Not in a novel, but in the most direct way possible. An open letter to the President of France, published in a newspaper, naming names, laying out the evidence, accusing the army and the government of a criminal conspiracy. It would be impossible to ignore. It would force a reckoning. He sat at his desk in Meudon and wrote through the night. The letter ran over 4,000 words. It detailed every piece of evidence proving Dreyfus's innocence. It named the officers who had fabricated documents. It accused the War Ministry of covering up the truth. And it ended with a series of accusations, each one beginning with the phrase, "J'accuse," I accuse. The letter was published on the front page of L'Aurore on January 13th, 1898. The headline, chosen by the newspaper's editor, was simply, "J'accuse." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. France exploded. The army demanded prosecution. Anti-Semitic riots broke out in Paris, Marseille, Lyon. Mobs attacked Jewish businesses. Zola's house was vandalized. He received death threats by the hundreds. Former friends abandoned him. Publishers cancelled contracts. The literary establishment turned against him. The government charged him with criminal libel. The trial began on February 7th, 1898. It was less a legal proceeding than a political circus. The judges refused to hear evidence about Dreyfus's innocence, limiting the case to whether Zola had defamed the military court. Witnesses for the defense were shouted down. The army's lawyers gave inflammatory speeches about honor and patriotism. Crowds outside the courthouse screamed for Zola's blood. The verdict was never in doubt. He was convicted and sentenced to the maximum penalty: 1 year in prison and a fine of 3,000 francs. His lawyer appealed, but the appeals court upheld the conviction. On July 18th, 1898, the day before he was to begin serving his sentence, Zola fled to England. It was the hardest decision of his life. He was 58 years old, famous, comfortable. Now he was an exile, living in cheap hotels in London suburbs, unable to speak English, separated from his wife, his friends, his country. He'd sacrificed everything for a man he'd never met, a Jewish army captain he had no personal connection to. Why did he do it? His critics said it was for publicity, for attention, for money, but Zola had plenty of all three. He didn't need more fame or wealth. The truth is simpler and more complicated. He did it because it was right, because a man was suffering unjustly, and Zola had the platform to help him. Because the principles he'd spent his career exploring in fiction, the power of truth, the duty to expose injustice, demanded action in reality. The months in England were miserable. He couldn't work. He could barely leave his lodgings without being recognised. French newspapers continued to attack him. His books were pulled from stores. His plays were cancelled. Friends who'd supported him began to waver. Even his wife, Alexandrine, though she never wavered in her loyalty, wrote letters begging him to come home, to apologise, to end the nightmare. He refused. The truth was the truth. Dreyfus was innocent. That fact didn't change because it was inconvenient or dangerous to say so. And slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. More evidence emerged. The forgeries became impossible to deny. The officer who'd fabricated the key document confessed and committed suicide. Public opinion started to shift. Not completely, France remained bitterly divided, but enough that the government could no longer ignore the growing pressure to reopen the case. In June 1899, 11 months after fleeing, Zola returned to France. The charges against him had been dropped on a technicality. He was home, but the France he returned to was not the France he'd left. The Dreyfus Affair had torn the country apart, revealing fault lines that would shape French politics for generations. Families stopped speaking, friendships ended. The nation split into Dreyfusards, those who believed in his innocence, and anti-Dreyfusards, those who believed the army could do no wrong. Dreyfus was eventually pardoned in 1899 and fully exonerated in 1906, though Zola wouldn't live to see the final vindication. The affair had aged him. The stress, the exile, the constant attacks had taken their toll. He looked older than his years. His hands shook when he wrote. The optimistic trilogy he'd been planning before J'accuse seemed like a relic from another life, but he kept working. That was what he did. He finished the trilogy, called The Three Cities, though it sold poorly. He started a new series, The Four Gospels, meant to offer a vision of a better future. Work was refuge, work was purpose. If he stopped, he might have to think about what the affair had cost him. September 28, 1902. Zola and Alexandrine were in their Paris apartment. The weather had turned cold. They closed the windows and lit a fire in the bedroom fireplace. During the night, the chimney, which had been improperly sealed during recent repairs, began leaking carbon monoxide into the room. Alexandrine woke in the morning with a violent headache. She tried to wake her husband. He wouldn't respond. She screamed for help. Servants rushed in, opened the windows, called for doctors, but it was too late. Emile Zola was dead at 62. The official verdict was accidental death, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty chimney, an unfortunate accident. But rumours started immediately. The repairs had been recent. The chimney had been working fine before. Some whispered that anti-Dreyfusards had sabotaged it, that Zola had been murdered for his role in the affair. No proof ever emerged. The truth, if there was a sinister truth, died with whoever might have known it. What we know is this. On September 29th, 1902, France lost one of its greatest writers, under circumstances that remain, to this day, not entirely explained. The funeral was enormous. Thousands lined the streets. Anatole France delivered the eulogy, calling Zola a moment in the conscience of humanity. The government offered a state funeral, which the family accepted. But the ceremony was tense. Half of France still hated Zola for what he'd done. Police lined the route, fearing riots. At the cemetery, a nationalist tried to shoot Dreyfus, who'd come to honour the man who saved him. The shot missed. Even in death, Zola couldn't escape the controversy he'd unleashed. 6 years later, in 1908, the French government decided to honour Zola by moving his remains to the Pantheon, the great mausoleum in Paris, where France's heroes are buried. It was meant to be a moment of national reconciliation, an acknowledgement that Zola had been right all along. The ceremony didn't go smoothly. Protests erupted. Someone fired shots, wounding Dreyfus again, this time in the arm. The divide remained. But Zola was placed in the Pantheon anyway, his tomb just meters from Voltaire and Rousseau, the Enlightenment thinkers he'd admired his entire life. The inscription was simple: truth and justice. That's what his career had been about. That's what killed him. Now we need to understand what made Zola Zola before the affair, before the exile, before any of it. We need to go back to the beginning, to a childhood that shaped everything he would become. Émile-Édouard Charles-Antoine Zola was born on April 2nd, 1840, in Paris. His father, Francesco Zola, was an Italian engineer, a man of grand ambitions and practical skills. Francesco had designed railway systems, worked on harbour projects, dreamed of building a canal that would bring water to the dry region around Aix-en-Provence in southern France. His mother, Émilie Aubert, was French, the daughter of a glazier. She was young when they married, barely 20, and Francesco was in his 40s. It wasn't uncommon for the time. Men established themselves first, then married. The family moved to Aix-en-Provence when Emile was 3. His father had won the contract to build his canal, a project that would make the family's fortune if it succeeded. For a few years, life was comfortable. They had money, status, a house in town, and a country home for summers. Emile's earliest memories were of sunshine, of the Provençal countryside, of his father's confident energy as he supervised workers and engineers. Then in March 1847, Francesco Zola caught pneumonia while inspecting the canal construction site. He died within days. Emile was 7 years old. Everything collapsed. The canal project, unfinished, became the subject of legal disputes. Francesco's business partners and investors fought over the remains of his company. Emily, suddenly a widow with a young son, found herself with almost nothing. The comfortable life evaporated. They moved to cheaper lodgings. They sold possessions. They borrowed money from relatives who gave it reluctantly and with judgment. The trajectory of Emile's childhood had been set. He would grow up poor, hungry, aware every day of what they'd lost. School became his refuge. At the Collège Bourbon in Aix, Emile discovered he was good at writing. Not mathematics, not Latin, but French composition. His teachers noticed. His essays were vivid, detailed, full of emotion. He won prizes. For a poor kid whose father was dead and whose clothes were too small because his mother couldn't afford new ones, those prizes meant something. They meant he might have a way out. He made friends. Paul Cézanne, a classmate, would become one of the most important painters of the 19th century. They didn't know that yet. They were just two boys who loved art and hated the provincial narrowness of Aix. They took long walks in the countryside, talking about what they'd do when they escaped to Paris. Cézanne would paint, Zola would write. They'd be famous. They'd show everyone who'd looked down on them that they mattered. In 1858, Emily decided they had to move to Paris. There was no future in Aix, no prospects, no opportunities. In Paris, maybe Emile could finish his education, get a job, build something. They arrived with almost no money. The Paris Emile encountered was not the Paris of salons and boulevards. It was the Paris of cramped apartments, in poor neighbourhoods, of hunger, of cold winters when you couldn't afford enough coal to heat your room. Emile enrolled at the Lycée Saint-Louis to finish his baccalaureate, the exam that would allow him to enter university. He failed, twice. The second failure, in 1859, ended his formal education forever. He was 19, living in poverty, watching his mother work herself to exhaustion to keep them fed. He needed a job, any job. For 2 years he barely survived. He worked as a clerk at the docks, sorting customs declarations. The pay was miserable. The work was mind-numbing. He lived in a series of tiny rooms, sometimes sharing with friends to split the rent, sometimes alone because he couldn't afford even that. He was hungry constantly. Not the dramatic hunger of starvation, but the grinding, everyday hunger of someone who eats one meal a day and makes it last. This is the period that shaped his politics, his art, everything. When you're poor in a city like Paris, you see how the system works. You see the casual cruelty of landlords, the indifference of employers, the way society is organized to benefit people who already have money while grinding down everyone else. Zola never forgot it. Decades later, when he was famous and wealthy, he could still remember the exact feeling of walking past bakeries he couldn't afford, of watching rich people step over beggars without looking down. But even in the worst of it, he was writing. He filled notebooks with observations, with character sketches, with ideas for stories. He read everything he could borrow or steal: Hugo, Balzac, Stendhal, the great French novelists who'd shown that literature could be more than entertainment. that it could capture the reality of society, expose its injustices, make people see what they'd been trained to ignore. He wanted to do that. He wanted to matter. The breakthrough came in 1862. Louis Hachette, the publisher, was looking for young men to work in his advertising department. The pay wasn't much, but it was better than the docks, and it put Zola in contact with the world of books and writers. He took the job. Within months, he'd impressed his superiors enough that they moved him to the editorial department. Now he was reading manuscripts, working with authors, learning how publishing actually functioned. He was inside the industry he wanted to conquer. His own writing was getting better. He started publishing short stories and critical essays in small magazines. The essays got attention. Zola had strong opinions and wasn't afraid to express them. He defended new, controversial painters like Monet. He attacked the conservative establishment that controlled the art world. He argued that literature and art should represent reality, not idealized versions of it. Some people hated his reviews, others loved them. Either way, people were reading them. In 1865, he published his first novel. La Confession de Claude was autobiographical, drawing on his years of poverty and a failed relationship with a prostitute he'd tried to save. The book wasn't great, he'd admit that later, but it was scandalous enough to get noticed. The police nearly banned it for immorality. Hachette, worried about his publishing house's reputation, asked Zola to resign. He did. It was time anyway. He was going to make it as a full-time writer or starve trying. For the next few years, Zola survived on journalism and the occasional novel. He wrote art criticism, theatre reviews, political commentary, anything editors would pay for. He was building a reputation as a fierce, uncompromising voice. Conservative readers despised him. Progressive readers saw him as someone speaking truth to power. His novels were selling modestly, not enough to make him rich, but enough to keep going. Then in 1868, he had the idea that would define his career. He'd write a massive series of novels, 20 books following a single family through French society. Each novel would focus on different characters, different professions, different social classes. Together, they'd form a complete portrait of France during the Second Empire, the regime of Napoleon III that had ruled since 1852. He'd call it Les Rougon Macquart. It was absurdly ambitious. Publishers were skeptical. Who commits to 20 novels at once? But Zola was convinced. This would be his life's work, his legacy. The first book, La Fortune des Rougon, appeared in 1871. It sold poorly. The second, La Curée, did better, helped by its scandalous content about corruption and sexual decadence among the Parisian elite. The third, Le Ventre de Paris, established Zola as a major novelist. But it was the seventh book, published in 1877, that made him famous and nearly destroyed him. L'Assommoir was about the working class, about poverty, alcoholism, domestic violence. It was written in the language of the poor, full of slang and profanity. The critics were outraged. How dare Zola write about such vulgar subjects in such vulgar language? The public loved it. He settled into a routine. Write in the morning, research in the afternoon, entertain friends in the evening. He was producing a novel a year, each one a brick in the massive edifice he was building. Nana in 1880, about a courtesan who destroys the men around her. Germinal in 1885, about coal miners striking against brutal conditions. La Terre in 1887, about peasant life. La Bête Humaine in 1890, about railway workers and murder. Each book pushed boundaries, each was controversial, each sold. By 1893, when he published Le Docteur Pascal, the 20th and final novel of the series, Zola was one of the most famous writers in the world. Les Rougon Macquart was complete, a monument to his vision and discipline. He was wealthy, respected by progressive intellectuals, despised by conservatives. He'd achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a hungry boy in Paris. And then Alfred Dreyfus was arrested. And Zola, who'd spent his career writing about injustice, was faced with a choice. He could stay quiet, protect his comfortable life, let others fight this battle, or he could risk everything for a principle. We know what he chose, but understanding that choice requires understanding what naturalism meant to him, the philosophy that shaped every word he wrote. Naturalism wasn't just a literary style for Zola, it was a weapon, a way of seeing the world that demanded honesty, no matter how uncomfortable. He'd absorbed the scientific revolution of his century, Darwin's theories, Claude Bernard's experimental medicine, and he believed literature should work the same way. Observe reality, record what you see, draw conclusions, don't prettify, don't lie. Most French literature at the time was romantic, idealized. Heroes were noble, villains were evil. The poor were either saintly or deservedly wretched. Love conquered all, justice prevailed. It was fiction designed to comfort, to reassure readers that the world made sense. Zola rejected this completely. His characters weren't noble. They were driven by hunger, lust, fear, the need to survive. His poor weren't saintly. They drank, they fought, they betrayed each other because poverty destroyed people from the inside. His rich weren't refined. They were predators dressed in expensive clothes. Love didn't conquer anything. It was just another appetite. The critics called this pessimism. Zola called it truth. He studied his subjects obsessively before writing about them. When he wrote about coal miners in Germinal, he spent weeks underground in the mines of northern France, descending into the pits, watching men work in darkness, breathing the coal dust, seeing the danger they lived with every day. When he wrote about department stores in Au Bonheur des Dames, he haunted the great shops of Paris, observing how they seduced customers, how they treated workers, how they transformed shopping into theatre. This was the method. Immerse yourself, observe, take notes, then write what you found, not what people wanted to hear. His notebooks from these research trips still exist. Pages and pages of details, the exact layout of a mine shaft, the temperature at different depths, the words miners used, the songs they sang, the way light looked filtering through coal dust. He'd use maybe 5% of this material in the actual novel, but he needed to know everything to write anything. The philosophy behind this was straightforward. Human beings aren't free agents making rational choices. We're animals shaped by our environment and our heredity. Change the environment, you change the person. This wasn't fatalism, it was the opposite. If environment determines behaviour, then improve the environment and you improve humanity. This is why Zola's novels were political without being propaganda. He wasn't telling workers to revolt. He was showing readers what workers' lives were actually like, betting that once people understood the reality, they'd demand change. The establishment hated this. When Germinal appeared, depicting mine owners as callous and striking workers, as human beings pushed past endurance, conservative newspapers accused Zola of inciting revolution. The Catholic Church condemned him for undermining moral order. Politicians called him dangerous. He didn't care, or rather, he cared that they were angry. It meant he was hitting targets. But there was something else driving his work, something deeper than method or politics. Zola had grown up poor. He'd known hunger, humiliation, the casual cruelty of a society that treated the poor as disposable. He'd clawed his way up through talent and ferocious work. But he'd never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless, to watch injustice happen and have no voice to protest. His novels were that voice. Every corrupt official he exposed, every exploitation he documented, every suffering person he made real on the page was revenge against the system that had tried to crush him. By the time the Dreyfus Affair erupted, Zola had been fighting this war for 3 decades. He was 57 years old, rich enough to be comfortable, famous enough to be influential, tired enough to want peace. The affair should have been none of his business. He wasn't Jewish. He had no connection to the military. He'd never met Dreyfus. This was a political scandal, and Zola had always kept his distance from party politics. He was a novelist, not an activist, but then he started paying attention. Alfred Dreyfus had been convicted of treason in December 1894. The evidence was thin. A bordereau, a handwritten note listing French military secrets, supposedly sent to the German military attaché. Handwriting experts disagreed about whether it matched Dreyfus's hand. There was no motive established, no witnesses, just this single document and the certainty of the military judges that Dreyfus was guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. His rank was stripped in a humiliating ceremony. He was shipped across the ocean to rot. For 2 years, the case was closed. Then cracks started appearing. Major Georges Picquart, the new head of French counterintelligence, discovered evidence suggesting the real traitor was Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, a gambling-addicted aristocrat with debts and German connections. Picquart brought this to his superiors, expecting them to reopen the case. Instead, they transferred him to Tunisia, ordered him to keep quiet. When he persisted, they began threatening him. The military had made a mistake, but admitting it would humiliate the army, the most respected institution in France. Better to let one innocent man suffer than admit the army could be wrong. This is when the Dreyfus family hired lawyers and began their public campaign. This is when French society split in half. The Dreyfusards believed in the innocence of the convicted captain. They demanded a retrial, transparency, justice. They included intellectuals, republicans, anti-clericals, anyone who distrusted military and clerical authority. The anti-Dreyfusards believed in the army's honour above all. They saw the push for a retrial as an attack on French institutions, probably orchestrated by Jews and Germans seeking to weaken France. They included monarchists, Catholics, nationalists, the traditional powers who'd never accepted the Republic. It wasn't really about Dreyfus anymore. It was about what kind of country France would be. Zola watched all this from his house in Meudon. He read the newspapers. He discussed it with friends. He was troubled, but he was also cautious. He'd spent his career observing, not crusading, let others fight this battle. Then in late 1897, Esterhazy was court-martialed for the original crime. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He'd written the bordereau. His handwriting matched. He had motive, opportunity, everything. The court-martial lasted 2 days. Esterhazy was acquitted. The fix was obvious. The army had decided to protect him because admitting his guilt meant admitting they'd destroyed Dreyfus for nothing. They'd rather acquit a guilty man than acknowledge their mistake. Something broke inside Zola when he heard the verdict. This wasn't politics. This wasn't about institutions or ideology. This was simple injustice, the powerful crushing the weak, and everyone pretending it was justice. He'd spent 30 years writing about exactly this, about systems that protected the guilty and punished the innocent, about corruption disguised as order, about institutions that valued their own reputation more than truth. He'd written 20 novels exposing these mechanisms. Now, watching them operate in real time, he couldn't stay silent. He started writing, not a novel, an open letter. He worked on it for days, furious, focused, channeling 3 decades of rage at injustice into 4,000 words. His target wasn't just the generals who'd convicted Dreyfus, or the judges who'd acquitted Esterhazy. It was the entire system. The way the military justice system operated in secret. The way evidence was hidden. The way witnesses were intimidated. The way truth was treated as negotiable when institutions were threatened. He named names. General Mercier, who'd overseen the original court-martial. General Billot, the current war minister. The handwriting experts who'd lied. The judges who'd ignored evidence. He accused them directly of knowingly convicting an innocent man and protecting a guilty one. This was dangerous. Under French law, accusing specific people of specific crimes without proof was criminal libel. Zola knew this. He was counting on it. His plan was simple. Get sued, force a trial. In court, the Dreyfusards could present all the evidence that the military had suppressed. The truth would come out. Dreyfus would be exonerated. Justice would be served. It was naive. It was brave. It was probably the most important thing he'd ever do. He finished writing on January 12th. He showed it to his wife, Alexandrine. She was terrified. This would destroy him. He'd be prosecuted, probably convicted. Everything they'd built could be lost. He knew. He wrote anyway. He took the letter to Georges Clemenceau, editor of the newspaper L'Aurore and one of the most prominent Dreyfusards. Clemenceau read it. He understood immediately what Zola was doing and what it would cost. They needed a title, something that would grab attention, that would frame the piece as an accusation, not just an essay. Clemenceau suggested, "J'accuse, I accuse," simple, direct, unforgettable. The letter was published on January 13th, 1898. The front page of L'Aurore, headline in massive type, "J'accuse." Below it, in smaller letters, "Letter to the President of the Republic." Then Zola's words, burning off the page. The print run was 300,000 copies, all sold within hours. The letter was reprinted in newspapers across France, across Europe, across the world. Within days, everyone knew what Zola had written. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Anti-Dreyfusard newspapers called for Zola's arrest. Nationalist mobs gathered outside his house. His windows were broken. Threats arrived daily. He'd be killed. His home would be burned. He'd pay for his treason. The government moved quickly. Within weeks, Zola was charged with criminal libel. Not for the accusations themselves, but for one sentence about the Esterhazy court-martial. The charge was narrow, designed to prevent the trial from becoming a referendum on Dreyfus's guilt. Zola didn't care. He wanted the trial. He wanted the spotlight. He wanted France to see what its institutions were doing. The trial began on February 7th, 1898. It lasted 2 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day. Journalists from around the world covered it. Outside, nationalist mobs chanted for Zola's head. Inside, it became clear immediately that this wouldn't be the fair hearing Zola had imagined. The judge, Albert Delagorgue, repeatedly prevented the defense from discussing the actual Dreyfus case. Every time Zola's lawyer, Fernand Laborie, tried to present evidence of Dreyfus's innocence or Esterhazy's guilt, the judge shut him down. Irrelevant. Outside the scope, not permitted. The trial couldn't be about whether Dreyfus was guilty, only about whether Zola had libelled the judges who'd acquitted Esterhazy. Witnesses were called. Military officials testified that the army's honour was beyond question. Handwriting experts insisted their original analysis was correct. No one was allowed to examine the actual evidence from the Dreyfus case. Zola took the stand. He was calm, dignified, devastating. He explained exactly why he'd written the letter. He stood by every word. He said he'd do it again. The prosecutor called him a traitor, a foreign agent, a man who'd sold out France for Jewish gold. The standard accusations. Zola didn't flinch. The verdict was foreordained. On February 23rd, after 15 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 35 minutes. Guilty, maximum sentence, 1 year in prison, 3,000 francs fine. The courtroom erupted. Zola's supporters were devastated. His enemies celebrated. But something had shifted. The trial had been covered everywhere. People who'd never heard of Dreyfus now knew the case. The military's refusal to allow evidence had looked suspicious. Zola's calm dignity had impressed even skeptics. The anti-Dreyfusard victory was tactical. The strategic battle was just beginning. Zola appealed. The conviction was overturned on a technicality. A new trial was scheduled. Same charges, same judge, same outcome, Guilty again, same sentence. His lawyers advised him to flee. If he stayed, he'd be imprisoned. From prison, he couldn't write, couldn't speak, couldn't fight. His usefulness to the Dreyfus Affair cause would end. On July 18th, 1898, the day before he was to report to prison, Emile Zola boarded a train to Calais. From there, he crossed to England. He arrived in London under a false name, carrying almost nothing. The most famous writer in France was now a fugitive, living in rented rooms, unable to speak the language, cut off from his country and his wife. The exile would last 11 months. Zola's departure handed his enemies an easy propaganda victory. See, they crowed. He ran. Proof of his guilt, proof that he knew he'd lied. A true Frenchman would have stayed and faced justice. But Zola understood something his critics didn't. The cause mattered more than his pride. From England he could still write, still think, still wait for the moment when France would need him again. While Zola lived in shabby English boarding houses, the Dreyfus Affair was tearing France apart. The country split into two camps, Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards, and the division ran through families, friendships, institutions. Dinner parties ended in screaming matches. Colleagues stopped speaking. Duels were fought. Riots erupted in cities across France. Anti-Semitic violence surged. Jewish shops were vandalized. Jewish families were attacked in the streets. The poison that had sent Dreyfus to Devil's Island was now infecting the entire nation. The army remained defiant. Dreyfus was guilty. The verdict was final. Any suggestion otherwise was an attack on France itself. But cracks were appearing in their story. In August 1898, a new piece of evidence emerged that would blow everything apart. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Joseph Henry, the same officer who'd compiled the secret file, was called to testify. Under aggressive questioning, he began to sweat. His answers grew evasive. Finally, investigators confronted him directly. One of the documents in the secret file, a letter supposedly proving Dreyfus's guilt, was a forgery. And Henry had created it. He'd taken two real documents, cut them apart, and pasted pieces together to create a new letter that implicated Dreyfus. Then he'd added it to the file. The smoking gun was a fake. Henry confessed. He claimed he'd done it to protect France, to strengthen a case he knew was just, to silence the doubters. He was arrested immediately. The next day, August 31st, 1898, he was found dead in his cell. His throat had been cut with a razor. The official verdict was suicide. His death should have ended the case. The primary evidence was forged. The man who'd forged it was dead. Dreyfus's innocence seemed undeniable, but the anti-Dreyfusards didn't retreat. They doubled down. Henry became a martyr. He died defending France's honour against the Jewish conspiracy. His widow received donations from across the country. Tens of thousands of francs poured in. A monument was planned. The logic was insane, but it didn't matter. Too many people had committed too deeply. Admitting Dreyfus was innocent meant admitting the army had destroyed an innocent man, meant admitting France's institutions were corrupt, meant admitting the anti-Semites had been wrong. For many, that was impossible. But the political situation was shifting. The government that had prosecuted Zola fell. A new administration took power, one less committed to defending the military at all costs. In September 1898, the new Minister of War ordered a review of the Dreyfus case. The review took months. Every document was examined. Every witness was interviewed again. The conclusion was inescapable. The case against Dreyfus was a shambles. The handwriting analysis was flawed. The secret evidence was forged. Esterhazy was the real traitor. In June 1899, the Court of Cassation, France's highest court, annulled Dreyfus's conviction. He would get a new trial. After 4 years on Devil's Island, Alfred Dreyfus was coming home. The ship that carried him back to France arrived in darkness. Security was extreme. Dreyfus had received death threats. The authorities feared assassination attempts. He was transported under guard to the military prison at Rennes, where his new court-martial would take place. When people saw him, they were shocked. This wasn't the young captain who'd been arrested in 1894. This was a broken man. His hair had gone white. His body was skeletal. He walked with difficulty. Years of fever, malnutrition, and isolation had destroyed him physically. But he was alive, and he would get to defend himself at last. The trial began on August 7th, 1899. Once again, the world watched. Journalists filled every available space. The streets outside the courthouse were packed. This time, the defense could present evidence. This time, witnesses would be cross-examined. This time, Dreyfus himself could speak. Fernand Laborie, Zola's lawyer, represented Dreyfus. He was methodical and devastating. He dismantled the handwriting evidence. He exposed the forged documents. He showed how Esterhazy's handwriting matched the bordereau perfectly. He called witnesses who testified to Esterhazy's debts, his desperation, his access to military secrets. The prosecution had nothing. They repeated the old accusations. They insisted the original verdict was correct. They claimed new secret evidence existed but couldn't be shown in open court. The same playbook from 1894. Dreyfus himself was a problematic witness. Years of torture had left him emotionally flat. He spoke in a monotone. He showed little passion. Some observers found him unsympathetic. They'd expected fire. They got a man so damaged he could barely function. But the evidence didn't care about sympathy. Document after document pointed to innocence. Witness after witness contradicted the prosecution. Any objective observer could see the truth. The verdict came on September 9th. Guilty, with extenuating circumstances. Sentenced to 10 years, time served counted. The courtroom erupted. How could this be possible? How could 7 military judges look at this evidence and still vote to convict? The answer was simple and terrible. The army could not admit error. To acquit Dreyfus would be to destroy the institution's credibility, so they split the baby. Guilty, but with a reduced sentence that would let him go free immediately. It was a moral catastrophe disguised as a compromise. Dreyfus's lawyers wanted to appeal. They wanted to keep fighting. But Dreyfus himself was done. He couldn't endure another trial. He couldn't return to prison. He couldn't survive more years of this nightmare. 10 days after the verdict, the President of France offered a pardon. Dreyfus accepted it. A pardon isn't an exoneration, it's forgiveness for a crime. By accepting it, Dreyfus tacitly accepted guilt. It was a bitter pill, but he swallowed it. He wanted to see his wife, his children. He wanted to sleep in his own bed. He wanted to stop fighting. The Dreyfusards were furious. They hadn't fought for 5 years to secure a pardon. They'd fought for justice, for vindication, for an admission of innocence. The pardon felt like a betrayal, but they understood. The man had suffered enough. Emile Zola returned to France in June 1899, after the Court of Cassation overturned Dreyfus's conviction. The amnesty law passed that year meant he wouldn't face imprisonment. He returned to his home, his wife, his work. He'd been gone nearly a year. He followed the Rennes trial obsessively. He wrote articles supporting Dreyfus. When the guilty verdict came, he was devastated. When Dreyfus accepted the pardon, he was conflicted. He understood the decision, but he'd wanted total victory. For 3 years after his return, Zola continued writing. He published more novels. He remained engaged in public affairs, but the affair had taken something from him. The optimism that had powered his work was damaged. He'd seen what France could become when fear and hatred took control. He'd watched institutions he'd trusted reveal themselves as corrupt. He'd learned that truth and evidence weren't always enough. On September 28, 1902, Emile Zola went to bed in his Paris apartment. He was 62 years old. It was late summer, the night still warm, but he'd had a fire lit in the bedroom fireplace to take off the chill. The next morning, his wife Alexandrine woke feeling ill. Dizzy, nauseous, barely able to move, she tried to wake Emile. He didn't respond. Servants broke down the door. Both Zola and his wife were unconscious. The room was thick with smoke. The chimney had been blocked, probably by debris. Carbon monoxide had filled the bedroom while they slept. Alexandrine survived. Emile Zola was dead. The official verdict was accidental death, a terrible coincidence, a blocked flu. But rumours started immediately and have never quite died. Zola had enemies, powerful enemies, men who'd sworn revenge. The chimney could have been blocked deliberately. No investigation was conducted. No one was ever charged. We'll never know for certain. But this much is true. The man who'd written a J'accuse died in circumstances that were, at minimum, deeply suspicious. His funeral was enormous. Tens of thousands lined the streets. Dreyfusards mourned him as a hero. Anti-Dreyfusards stayed away, or celebrated quietly. France remained divided, but the fight wasn't finished. Dreyfus was pardoned, not exonerated. He still carried the stain of guilt. His supporters couldn't let that stand. In 1903, they demanded a new investigation. The government resisted, but pressure mounted. Finally, in 1904, a formal review began. This time there was no rush. Investigators took their time. They examined every document, tracked down every witness still living, reconstructed the entire conspiracy. The report, published in 1906, was devastating. It confirmed what the Dreyfusards had been saying all along. Dreyfus was innocent. Esterhazy was guilty. The army had knowingly convicted an innocent man and had spent 12 years covering it up. On July 12, 1906, the Court of Cassation issued its final ruling. Dreyfus's conviction was annulled without the possibility of retrial. The verdict was clear, not guilty. 13 days later, Alfred Dreyfus was readmitted to the army with the rank of Major. A public ceremony was held in the courtyard of the École Militaire, the same place where his degradation had occurred 12 years earlier. His sword was returned. His decorations were restored. France officially admitted its error. It should have been a moment of triumph. In many ways it was. But Dreyfus was 47 years old. His health was ruined. His career was finished. He'd lost 12 years. His children had grown up without him. No ceremony could give that back. He served in the army during World War I, despite his age and health. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel. After the war, he retired quietly. He attended ceremonies when invited. He never spoke much about his ordeal. In 1935, at age 75, Alfred Dreyfus died in Paris. He'd outlived most of his persecutors. He'd outlived Zola by 33 years. He'd seen his name cleared, his honour restored. But the cost had been everything. The Dreyfus Affair didn't end with his exoneration. It continued to shape France for decades. The divisions it created, the hatreds it exposed, the questions it raised about justice, truth, and institutional power, none of that disappeared with the final verdict. If anything, the affair revealed something that couldn't be put back in the box. The anti-Semitism that had fueled the persecution of Dreyfus didn't vanish. It went underground. It waited. 40 years later, when France fell to Nazi Germany, many of the same families, the same newspapers, the same institutions that had screamed for Dreyfus's blood would collaborate with the occupation. The Vichy regime's anti-Jewish laws weren't imported from Berlin. They had French roots that went back to the 1890s. But the affair also created something else. It showed that resistance was possible, that ordinary citizens could challenge institutional power, that writers, intellectuals, and regular people could force a reckoning with injustice. Every Dreyfusard who'd signed a petition, attended a rally, defended Zola in conversation with hostile relatives, had helped create a culture where speaking truth to power wasn't just possible, but necessary. The phrase j'accuse entered the language as shorthand for moral courage, for standing up when staying silent would be easier, for risking everything to tell a truth that powerful people wanted buried. Emile Zola's body was moved to the Pantheon in 1908, 6 years after his death. It's where France buries its heroes. His remains lie there now, alongside Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo. The ceremony was attended by thousands. Alfred Dreyfus was there. As the coffin was being moved, a right-wing journalist named Louis Gregory pulled out a pistol and shot Dreyfus twice. The bullets hit him in the arm. He survived. Gregory was arrested, tried, and acquitted. The jury ruled he'd acted in a moment of patriotic passion. Even in 1908, even after full exoneration, the poison remained. The Dreyfus Affair was over. Alfred Dreyfus was exonerated, rehabilitated, and restored to his rank. Justice had been served technically, but the question remained, what had it all meant? Theodor Herzl had his answer. The Viennese journalist who covered the Dreyfus trial for his newspaper had witnessed something he couldn't unsee. Not just the conviction of an innocent man, not just the anti-Semitism that saturated French society, something deeper. He'd watched a nation destroy one of its own officers for being Jewish, not in Russia, where pogroms were routine, not in some backward corner of Europe, where medieval prejudices still held sway. In France, the France of liberty, equality, fraternity, the France that had emancipated its Jews a century earlier, the most enlightened nation in Europe. If it could happen in France, it could happen anywhere. Herzl had been a thoroughly assimilated Jew. He'd believed that education, achievement, and integration would solve the Jewish question. That anti-Semitism was a relic that would fade with modernization. The Dreyfus Affair shattered that belief. In 1896, he published a pamphlet, The Jewish State. The argument was simple. Jews would never be safe as minorities in other people's countries. They needed their own nation, a homeland where they could govern themselves, defend themselves, and live without fear. The idea wasn't new. Jews had dreamed of returning to their ancestral land for 2,000 years. But Herzl wasn't talking about a religious dream. He was proposing a political program. Modern nationalism applied to the Jewish people. He founded the Zionist movement in 1897. The first Zionist Congress met in Basel, Switzerland. 200 delegates from 17 countries attended. They debated, argued, and ultimately agreed on a goal: establishing a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Herzl would die in 1904, 44 years old, his health destroyed by overwork. He wouldn't live to see his dream realized, but the movement he started would change history. 50 years after his death, the State of Israel would declare independence. The connection between the Dreyfus Affair and the founding of Israel is direct. One led to the other. The persecution of a French army captain helped create a nation. Meanwhile, in France, another transformation was underway. The Dreyfusards had won. But what exactly had they won? The left had discovered something during the affair. Intellectuals could be a political force. Writers, professors, journalists, people with no official power could challenge institutions and win. This was new. Before Dreyfus, French politics had been dominated by traditional power structures. The military, the church, the established political parties. The affair showed that mobilized public opinion, led by intellectuals, could force change. This became the model for progressive politics in the 20th century. The independent intellectual speaking truth to power. The writer as conscience of the nation. The professor as activist. All of this traces back to the Dreyfusards. The socialists learned a different lesson. Jean Jaurès had thrown himself into the Dreyfus campaign. He defended Zola, attacked the military, and helped force the revision. But what had it accomplished for the working class? Nothing. The socialists had spent years fighting for a bourgeois army officer, years that could have been spent organising workers, fighting for economic justice, building class consciousness. And for what? So one rich man could get his medals back? This debate would split the socialist movement. Should the left focus on defending democratic institutions against reactionary forces? Or should it concentrate exclusively on economic struggle, dismissing civil liberties as bourgeois concerns? The question wasn't resolved. It still isn't. The Catholic Church faced its own reckoning. The Church had largely sided with the anti-Dreyfusards. Catholic newspapers had printed some of the vilest anti-Semitic propaganda. Catholic intellectuals had defended the military and attacked Zola. The assumption of authority, the assumption that institutional power must be respected, had led the Church into moral catastrophe. The French Republic responded with force. Between 1901 and 1905, the government passed a series of laws designed to break the Church's influence. Religious orders were expelled. Church property was confiscated. The concordat that had governed church-state relations since Napoleon was abolished. The separation of church and state in France, one of the defining features of modern French secularism, was a direct consequence of the Dreyfus Affair. The military never truly reformed. The generals who'd falsified evidence, who'd lied under oath, who'd knowingly convicted an innocent man, most of them faced no consequences. Some retired quietly, others continued their careers. A few were even promoted. The institutional culture that had produced the affair, the obsession with honour over truth, the belief that admitting error was worse than perpetuating injustice, that culture survived. It would resurface during World War I, when French generals sent millions of men to die in futile offensives rather than admit their tactics weren't working. It would resurface again during World War II, when the French army collapsed in 6 weeks, and its leaders, rather than continuing the fight, chose collaboration. The poison had spread too deep. But something else had happened. Something harder to measure, but perhaps more important. A generation of French citizens had been forced to choose, not between left and right, though that was part of it, between truth and lies, between justice and power, between what you knew was right and what everyone around you was screaming at you to believe. Everyone who'd lived through the affair had been tested. Some had passed, some had failed, but nobody had been allowed to remain neutral. The event had been too large, too consuming, too impossible to ignore. Georges Clemenceau, the radical politician who'd been one of Zola's earliest defenders, would become Prime Minister during World War I. He'd lead France through its darkest hours. When asked later what the Dreyfus Affair had taught him, he said it had shown him that France was worth saving, that despite everything, despite the hatred and the lies and the institutional corruption, there were enough decent people to make fighting for the Republic worthwhile. Anatole France, the novelist who'd marched with the Dreyfusards, would win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1921. His acceptance speech barely mentioned his novels. He talked about Dreyfus, about Zola, about what it meant to stand for justice when justice wasn't popular. Charles Péguy, the Catholic writer who'd broken with the church over the affair, would die in 1914 at the Battle of the Marne, shot through the head leading his men in an attack. He was 41. His last writings had been about reconciliation, about healing the wounds the affair had opened. He didn't live to see whether healing was possible. And what about the forger? What about Hubert Joseph Henry? His widow Berthe never accepted that her husband had done anything wrong. She spent the rest of her life defending his memory, insisting he'd been a patriot who'd done what was necessary to protect France. She collected donations from anti-Dreyfusards to fund a monument in his honour. The monument was never built. The donations dried up. By the time she died in 1920, most people had forgotten who Henry was. History remembers him now only as the man whose forgery was so crude it fell apart under examination. His life reduced to a footnote about a clumsy lie. Perhaps that's the cruelest fate of all. To be remembered only for your worst moment, for the thing you did that destroyed everything you'd worked for. Henry had been a career soldier, 33 years of service. None of that mattered anymore. Only the forgery remained. The Dreyfus Affair revealed something about how institutions protect themselves. When confronted with evidence of error, the first instinct isn't to correct the mistake. It's to protect the institution, to close ranks, to attack the accusers rather than examine the accusation. This pattern repeats throughout history. Institutions don't reform because someone points out they're wrong. They reform when the cost of not reforming becomes unbearable. When public pressure makes the old way impossible to maintain. The French military didn't admit error because someone showed them the evidence. They'd seen the evidence. They'd known Dreyfus was innocent. They admitted error only when continuing the lie became more dangerous than confessing the truth. This is the lesson that every whistleblower, every investigative journalist, every person who's tried to expose institutional wrongdoing has learned. The institution will not thank you. It will fight you. It will destroy you if it can. And even when you win, even when the truth comes out, the institution will survive, and you'll be the one who pays the price. Emile Zola paid with his life, whether the death was accident or murder. Alfred Dreyfus paid with 12 years and his health. Picard paid with his career. Mathieu Dreyfus paid with his fortune and his peace of mind. What did they win? The question isn't rhetorical. They won a principle. The principle that truth matters. That justice isn't just whatever powerful people say it is. That individuals have the right to challenge institutions when those institutions are wrong. This sounds abstract. It wasn't. Every legal reform that came after the affair, every restriction on military courts, every protection for the accused, every rule requiring evidence to be disclosed to the defence, these were concrete victories. They made it harder for what happened to Dreyfus to happen again. Not impossible, just harder. The affair also established something else, the role of the press in holding power accountable. Before Dreyfus, newspapers were mostly partisan organs that printed what their political faction wanted readers to believe. During the affair, papers like L'Aurore and Le Siècle published documents, exposed lies, and investigated the military's claims. This wasn't muckraking in the American sense, it was something different. It was the press as opposition, as institutional skeptic, as the force that assumes power is lying until proven otherwise. That tradition, for better or worse, shapes journalism to this day. The assumption that official statements are propaganda. The belief that institutions will cover up wrongdoing if they can. The conviction that someone needs to be watching the watchers. The Dreyfus Affair made that role possible. It showed that the press, when it chose to be, could be powerful enough to challenge the military, the government, even the president. But the affair also showed the dark side of that power. The anti-Dreyfusard press had lied just as much as the military. La Libre Parole had invented stories. L'Intransigeant had printed forgeries as fact. The Catholic papers had trafficked in the vilest conspiracy theories. Press freedom cuts both ways. The same freedom that allowed Zola to publish J'accuse allowed Drumont to publish his Daily Poison. You can't have one without the other. The answer isn't censorship. The answer is more speech, better speech, speech that counters lies with truth. That was the Dreyfusard position anyway. Whether it worked is still being debated. What's certain is that the affair changed what it meant to be French. Before Dreyfus, French identity was relatively simple. You were French if you were born in France, spoke French, and accepted French culture. Religion complicated this for Jews, but assimilation was supposed to solve that. Accept French values, abandon your particular identity, and you'd be French like everyone else. Dreyfus had done all of that. He'd assimilated completely. He was more French than most of the people screaming for his blood, and it hadn't mattered. When the chips were down, when the military needed a scapegoat, his Jewishness was all that mattered. This taught French Jews something devastating. Assimilation wasn't protection. You could serve France, die for France, devote your life to France, and France could still turn on you overnight. Some Jews responded by becoming Zionists. If France wouldn't have them, they'd build their own nation. Others responded by becoming more French, proving their loyalty even harder. Still others disappeared into the woodwork, changing their names, converting, doing whatever it took to erase the identity that had marked Dreyfus for destruction. None of these strategies worked perfectly. 40 years later, when the Nazis occupied France, French authorities would round up Jews for deportation with enthusiastic efficiency. Being French didn't save you. Being assimilated didn't save you. Nothing saved you except luck or escape. The straight line from Dreyfus to Vichy isn't metaphorical. The anti-Semitism that the affair exposed didn't disappear. It waited, and when circumstances allowed, it returned with genocidal fury. But we're not here to trace that line tonight. We're here to understand what Dreyfus himself did after the pardon, after everything he'd endured, after the nation had torn itself apart over his name. What does a man do with the rest of his life? The answer is stranger than you'd expect. Alfred Dreyfus walked out of prison in September 1899. He was 39 years old. He'd spent nearly 5 years in hell. His health was ruined. His reputation was still contested by half the country, and the pardon that freed him wasn't exoneration. It was political compromise. The government had basically said, "We're tired of this fight, so we're letting you go, but we're not saying you're innocent." For Dreyfus, this was unbearable. He'd maintained his innocence through years of torture. He'd refused to break even when breaking would have been easier. And now France was offering him freedom without justice. Most men would have taken it and disappeared. Dreyfus refused. He spent the next 7 years fighting for full exoneration. He filed appeals, submitted new evidence, pressured politicians. He wanted his military rank restored. He wanted the guilty verdict erased. He wanted France to admit it had been wrong. This wasn't pride, it was principle. Dreyfus believed in the system. He believed France was capable of correcting its mistakes. He was going to make France prove him right. In 1906, the Court of Cassation finally overturned the Rennes verdict completely. Dreyfus was declared innocent. His rank was restored. He was promoted to Major and awarded the Legion of Honor. The ceremony took place in the courtyard of the École Militaire, the same place where he'd been publicly stripped of his rank 12 years earlier. The symbolism was intentional. France was acknowledging its error in the most public way possible. Dreyfus was 47 years old. He could have retired, lived quietly, written his memoirs and collected his pension. Instead, he chose to stay in the army. When World War I broke out in 1914, Dreyfus volunteered for active service. He was 55 years old, in poor health, and had every reason to sit the war out. He served anyway. He commanded artillery units, he fought at Verdun and the Somme. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, then colonel. He retired in 1918 with full honours. Think about that for a moment. The institution that had destroyed his life, that had tortured him, that had tried to break him, he stayed loyal to it. He served it until the end. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. It was something else. Dreyfus genuinely believed in France. Not the France that had betrayed him, but the France that could correct itself. The France that was worth fighting for, even after it had tried to kill him. He died in 1935 at age 75. The funeral was attended by thousands. The President of France gave a eulogy. The military provided full honours. By then, most of the people who'd persecuted him were dead or discredited. The Dreyfus Affair had passed into history. It was a settled matter. Justice had been done, except it hadn't, not really. Because here's what happened next. 5 years after Dreyfus died, France fell to Nazi Germany in 6 weeks. The Third Republic collapsed. The Vichy government took power, and one of its first acts was to repeal the laws that had granted Jews full citizenship. The same laws that had made Dreyfus French. The Vichy regime hunted down Jews with methodical efficiency. They didn't need the Germans to tell them how. They already knew. They'd been practicing since Dreyfus. 75,000 French Jews were deported to death camps, a quarter of the Jewish population. Most were sent by French police, on French trains, following orders from French officials. The Germans didn't have to force this. The French did it themselves. Dreyfus's granddaughter, Madeleine Lévy, was arrested in 1944. She was sent to Auschwitz. She survived, but barely. When she returned to France after the war, she found that most of her family had been murdered. The direct descendants of Alfred Dreyfus had been hunted down and killed by the country their grandfather had served. You can draw a straight line from the Dreyfus Affair to Vichy. The anti-Semitism that exploded during the affair never went away. It went underground. It waited. And when France fell, it returned with a vengeance. The same newspapers that had screamed about Jewish traitors in 1898 screamed about Jewish conspiracies in 1940. The same politicians who defended the military's right to convict Dreyfus defended Vichy's right to deport Jews. The same arguments, the same rhetoric, the same hatred. France spent decades pretending this didn't happen. After World War II, the official story was that France had been occupied, that the resistance had fought nobly, that Vichy was an aberration imposed by the Nazis. This was a comfortable lie. The truth was that Vichy was French, its leaders were French, its policies were French, its anti-Semitism was French. And it had roots that went back to Dreyfus. It wasn't until the 1990s that France began to confront this honestly. President Jacques Chirac acknowledged in 1995 that France bore responsibility for the deportations. He said the Vichy government had committed the irreparable and that France must face its history. It was the first time a French president had admitted this, 70 years after the fact. So what's the legacy of the Dreyfus Affair? It's complicated. On one hand, it was a victory for justice. Dreyfus was exonerated, the military was exposed, the Republic survived. The precedent was set that institutions can be challenged, that evidence matters, that truth can prevail even when power tries to suppress it. That's not nothing. That's actually enormous. On the other hand, the affair revealed a depth of hatred in French society that never fully disappeared. It showed that anti-Semitism wasn't just ignorance or prejudice. It was a political force that could mobilize millions. It could dominate elections. It could threaten the Republic itself. And when circumstances changed, it could turn genocidal. The affair also revealed something about how societies deal with their mistakes. France didn't really learn from Dreyfus. It learned to be more careful about getting caught. The military didn't stop fabricating evidence. It got better at covering its tracks. The anti-Semites didn't stop hating Jews. They waited for a better opportunity. This is the pattern we see over and over. A society confronts an injustice. It corrects the specific case. It pats itself on the back. And then it goes right back to business, as usual. The structures that produced the injustice remain intact. The attitudes that enabled it persist. Nothing fundamental changes except that people feel better about themselves for a while. The Dreyfus Affair matters because it's a case study in this pattern. It shows what happens when institutions prioritize their reputation over truth. When nationalism becomes a substitute for justice. When entire populations convince themselves that acknowledging error is weakness. The mechanisms that put Dreyfus on Devil's Island are still with us. Different targets, different justifications, same mechanisms. We like to think we've learned that modern societies wouldn't make the same mistakes, that we have safeguards now, checks and balances, human rights norms. The Dreyfus Affair suggests otherwise. It suggests that when institutions feel threatened, When national pride is at stake, when the crowd demands blood, the safeguards fail. Evidence gets ignored. Procedures get bypassed. Justice becomes negotiable. The only reason Dreyfus was saved is that enough people refused to stop fighting. Zola, Picard, Clemenceau, the Dreyfusards who risked everything. They didn't win because the system worked. They won despite the system. They won because they were willing to be hated, to be threatened, to lose everything for a principle. That's the real lesson of the affair. Justice doesn't happen automatically. It happens because people make it happen, because they refuse to accept convenient lies, because they insist on truth even when truth is dangerous. The system won't save you. The institutions won't save you. Only people willing to fight will save you. Dreyfus understood this in a strange way. He believed in France even after France betrayed him. Not because France deserved his faith, but because he refused to let the betrayers define what France was. He believed in the France that could be, the France that would eventually admit its error. He was willing to wait, to fight, to serve, until that France emerged. It did emerge, but only partially, only incompletely. The France that exonerated Dreyfus also produced Vichy. The France that honoured his service also deported his descendants. These aren't separate countries. They're the same country, containing the same contradictions, capable of both justice and genocide depending on circumstances. That's what the Dreyfus Affair teaches us. Nations aren't good or evil. They're capable of both. The question is which tendency wins in any given moment, and that depends entirely on whether enough people are willing to fight for the right thing when fighting is costly. Dreyfus fought, Zola fought, Picard fought. They won eventually. But the victory wasn't permanent. It never is. Every generation has to fight the same battles again, because the forces that produced the affair never disappear. They just wait. Right now, somewhere, an innocent person is being destroyed by their own institution. The details are different. The mechanisms are the same. Someone knows the truth, but stays silent because speaking would cost them their career. Someone has evidence but buries it because revealing it would embarrass the institution. Someone watches injustice happen and does nothing because everyone else is doing nothing. The Dreyfus Affair shows what happens when those people find their courage, when the silent starts speaking, when the complicit start resisting, when enough individuals decide that the truth matters more than their comfort. That's when institutions change, not before. Alfred Dreyfus spent 5 years in hell for a crime he didn't commit. He spent 7 more years fighting for justice. He spent the rest of his life serving the country that had tried to destroy him. He died believing he'd won, that France had learned, that the nightmare was over. He was wrong about that last part, but he was right about something more important, that individuals fighting for truth can change history, that institutions can be forced to correct themselves, that justice is possible if enough people demand it. The affair is over. The lesson isn't. It's still being written every time someone has to choose between truth and convenience, between justice and comfort, between speaking up and staying silent. Dreyfus made his choice. So did Zola. So did Picard. Now the choice is ours. We sit here, more than a century removed from those events, and we tell ourselves we've learned, that we have safeguards now, that institutions answer to the public. That truth can't be suppressed the way it was in 1894, but institutions are still institutions. They still close ranks when threatened. They still prioritize their reputation over accountability. The mechanisms that destroyed Dreyfus haven't disappeared. They've just evolved, different vocabulary, same instinct. Consider what it took to save one innocent man. A decade of fighting, a writer willing to face prison, a nation torn apart, thousands of people risking their careers, their safety, their lives. All of that just to force France to admit an obvious truth. The evidence of Dreyfus's innocence was clear from the beginning. Everyone in power knew it. They convicted him anyway. That's not an aberration. That's how power operates when left unchecked. The Dreyfus Affair isn't a story about how France almost failed, but ultimately redeemed itself. It's a story about how close justice came to losing completely, how easily truth can be buried, how readily populations embrace comfortable lies. Zola didn't write J'accuse because he thought it would work. He wrote it because staying silent was impossible. He gambled everything on the hope that enough people would care about truth to make a difference. He barely won that bet, and the victory was temporary. The anti-Semitism that destroyed Dreyfus returned with genocidal fury 40 years later. So what are we supposed to take from this? That fighting is pointless? That justice always loses in the end? No. The lesson is darker and more urgent. The lesson is that justice is never permanent. Each generation has to win it again. The battles Zola fought aren't finished. They're never finished. The forces that put Dreyfus on Devil's Island are still here, wearing different faces, using different language, targeting different victims. But the logic is identical. The institution matters more than the individual. Admitting error is weakness. Loyalty means silence. Right now, someone is being destroyed by a system that knows better. Someone is watching it happen and doing nothing because speaking up is dangerous. Someone is telling themselves it's not their problem, that someone else will fix it, that one person can't make a difference anyway. Zola proved that wrong. One person with a platform and the courage to use it can force a reckoning, but it costs everything. His reputation, his safety, his health, possibly his life. And even after winning, the victory is incomplete. The forces he fought outlived him. The hatred he exposed didn't disappear, but he fought anyway. Because the alternative was complicity. Because silence is a choice. Because if the people with platforms won't speak, the people without them have no chance at all. The Dreyfus Affair isn't history, it's a mirror. Look at your own society. Look at who's being destroyed. Look at what institutions are hiding. Look at what everyone knows, but nobody says. The mechanisms are already there. The question is whether enough people will care before it's too late. Dreyfus survived because Zola refused to let him die in silence. The next Dreyfus won't be a French officer, won't be falsely accused of treason, but they'll be innocent and they'll be destroyed by institutions protecting themselves. And whether they're saved depends entirely on whether enough people are willing to pay Zola's price. Truth doesn't win automatically. Justice doesn't happen because we wish for it. They happen because people make them happen. Because someone decides their comfort matters less than what's right. Because someone looks at an obvious injustice and refuses to look away. That's what Zola did. That's what the Dreyfusards did. They refused to accept that might makes right. They insisted truth still mattered, even when power said it didn't. They were willing to lose everything for a principle. The affair ended in 1906. The lesson is still being written. Every time someone has to choose between speaking up and staying quiet. Every time an institution tries to bury an inconvenient truth. Every time the crowd demands blood and someone asks if we're sure we have the right person. Emile Zola died choking on fumes from a blocked chimney. Was it accident or murder? We'll never know. But this we know. He died having done something that mattered. Having stood for truth when lies were easier. Having risked everything for someone he'd never met. Most of us won't get that chance. Most of us will never face a moment that clear, that consequential, that dangerous. But smaller versions of the same choice appear constantly. The colleague being scapegoated. The policy everyone knows is wrong, but nobody challenges. The convenient lie that protects the institution at someone else's expense. Those are our Dreyfus moments. Smaller stakes, same principle. Do we speak or stay silent? Do we risk our comfort for someone else's justice? Do we insist on truth even when it costs us? The affair shows what happens when enough people choose silence, and what happens when enough people choose to speak. Both outcomes are possible. Both are happening right now, somewhere. The only question is which one you're contributing to. Zola's last words were, "It is good." Maybe he meant the wine, maybe he meant his life, maybe he was just confused as the poison took him. We don't know. But looking at what he accomplished, what he sacrificed, what he stood for, maybe those were the right last words after all. He'd done what he could. He'd told the truth when it mattered. He'd refused to let an innocent man be destroyed in silence. He'd forced his nation to confront itself. The rest was up to others. The rest is still up to us. The starry heavens above and the moral law within, Kant's words, but Zola lived them. He looked up at the immensity of injustice and looked within to find the courage to fight it. He didn't win completely. He didn't save everyone. He didn't change everything. But he changed enough. He saved one man. He exposed one lie. He proved that speaking truth to power was possible. That's the inheritance, not certainty of victory, just the knowledge that fighting is possible. That one voice can matter. That truth, when defended fiercely enough, can survive even when institutions try to kill it. The Dreyfus Affair is over. Alfred Dreyfus is dead. Emile Zola is dead. Everyone involved is dead. But the choice they faced isn't dead. It's standing in front of you right now, in 1,000 small forms. What you do with it is your answer to the question they spent their lives addressing. What matters more, your comfort or someone else's justice? Your reputation or the truth? Your safety or your principles? They chose justice. They chose truth. They chose principles. And they paid for it. The question isn't whether you'll have to pay. The question is whether you'll be willing to. Because the Dreyfus Affair teaches one thing above all else. Justice doesn't happen because we hope for it. It happens because people like Zola demand it. Because people like Pickett risk everything for it. Because enough individuals decide that right matters more than easy. The rest is just commentary on that choice. Everything else, the politics, the history, the institutions, all of it comes down to whether people are willing to pay the price of truth when truth is expensive. Zola paid it. Now you know what it cost him. And now you know what he bought with that price. One man's freedom, one nation's reckoning, one moment when truth won against power. Not forever, just once, just enough. That's all we get. Moments, choices, chances to stand for something that matters. The affair is your reminder that those chances are real, that they count, and that what you do with them defines who you are, far more than anything you achieve when the stakes are low. Emile Zola died in Paris on September 28, 1902, the man who tore apart French society with nothing but a pen. The man who proved that truth, when defended fiercely enough, can challenge power. The man who showed that one person willing to pay the price can change history. His legacy isn't the books he wrote, though they're magnificent. It isn't the awards he won or the fame he achieved. His legacy is the choice he made when choosing was dangerous, when silence would have been safer, when speaking up cost him everything. That choice is still available. The stakes might be smaller, the danger might be less, but the principle is identical. Somewhere, right now, truth needs a defender. Justice needs a voice. An innocent person needs someone willing to say this is wrong. The question the Dreyfus Affair poses isn't what would you have done in 1898. It's what will you do tomorrow when your smaller, safer version of the same choice appears. When speaking up might cost you something. When staying quiet would be easier. Zola made his choice. History records what it cost him and what it accomplished. Now the choice is yours. The affair is over. The lesson lives on. What you do with it is up to you.